Amit sir, you would be letting them in, right, sir? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. So, good morning, everyone. It is indeed a great day for Department of History. We are organizing our first webinar, and I would like to start today's session with a silent prayer. Let us observe a note 30 seconds.
Ramya ma'am, you are not audible.
Yes, sir. I will speak now, sir. Thank you. Respected Father, Joskuti PD, my guide and mentor, our principal of Pristinity College, Honorable Resource Person of the Day, Professor M.A. Jacob, Dean Gopakumar Revi, and other honorable professors who have joined from various places, because I have around 200 plus registrations from universities alone throughout India. 15 universities professors have registered and shown interest along with my students. So it is a great day for us. So thank you. So I wish to humbly thank God and the management of this college for giving us this excellent opportunity. Even in the time of uncertainty, we are certain of one thing, that we want to pursue our academic interests, and we want to motivate our students to the path of academic success. So I would like to say a few words about Pristinity College. We are an autonomous institution. Our college was founded in 1999. It is managed by St. Joseph Province of Carmelites of Mary Immaculate. That is an indigenous Indian congregation founded, and we are affiliated to Bengaluru North University. We have went for 2 cycles of accreditation. We are going ahead for the 3rd cycle. We have been given A grade in both accreditation 2009 and 15, and in most of the All India surveys, we are one of the top institutions of India. We were rated as the best emerging institution of India in the last India Today survey. And yesterday in the NARF ranking, we are again placed as one of the top colleges of India. So out of 47,000 institutions, I feel we are one of the private institution who has been placed continuously in the NARF ranking. So this institution definitely believes in constant upskilling of students through various academic programs. So since March 24th, after lockdown has begun, we have conducted around 60 seminars and faculty development programs, engaging more than 6,000 people on a daily basis. So definitely our mentor, Father Joskuti PD, believes in what Aristotle has said, that education is an ornament in prosperity, but a refuge in adversity. So in times of adversity, we need to strengthen our inner belief and faith, and we should ask that this is the question, at what you look at, but what you see. What is catastrophic for one person can be a challenge and opportunity of growth for another. So from the Department of History, I place my humble welcome to Father Joskuti PD, the principal and mentor, our resource person of the day, Professor N.A. Jacob, who has gladly and immediately agreed to come to our session as a resource person, and also offered a very interesting topic for introspection about concept of self and how it has changed through historic times. So I also place my welcome to Professor Dr. Gopakumar Revi, Dean, Faculty of Humanities, our great support, and Professor S.J. Michael, Head Department of Social Sciences, and professors and students who have joined on time and who have decided to participate in this seminar for discussing this concept of self from a historical perspective. So with a positive and healthy self-concept, putting things in perspective becomes an exercise in critical thinking and reasoning. So in history, we learn lessons from events that happen on a daily basis. So it's indeed a great moment. So I am happy to have all of you today in this first webinar. With this note, I welcome Reverend Father Joskuti PD, our principal, a person with unending positivity and encouragement, a role model for all of us, to begin this session with introductory remarks. Over to you, Father.
Thank you, Professor Ramya. Good morning to all of you. Dr. N.A. Jacob, Honorable Resource Person for the day to inspire us. Dr. Gopakumar, the Dean, Faculty of Humanities. Professor
Excuse me, Father, can you please unmute? Father.
Sorry, the audio went mute. Honorable delegates and my dear friends, as Professor Remya was mentioning, for this webinar, we have a very interesting topic, concept of self, historical perspective. And one of the reasons for studying history is to understand the past and reflect one's actions. When the great philosopher Descartes proposed cogito ergo sum, which is being translated from Latin to English, I think, therefore I am. He opened up a new area of deliberation that believed the mind is the seat of our consciousness. It is not only houses our intellect and drive, but gives us our identity and sense of self. Taking historical perspective means understanding the social, cultural, intellectual, and emotional settings that shaped people's lives and actions in the past. It also demands comprehension of the vast differences between us in the present and those in the past. Certain cultures in the world place particular importance on personal independence, that self is more important than the group. While in other cultures, interpersonal relationships are given more importance than one's individual accomplishments. Indian culture, our own culture, believed in it. One of the current studies done on adolescents aged 20 years of age to 18 reveals that social media is the highest influence that affects the formation of an identity today. The discussion on self is multi-dimensional. And Professor Remya, in her introductory welcome speech, mentioned about Christ Jayanti College. And over the past 21 years, this college in Bangalore is trying to give the best to the students, to the society, and to the nation at large. And the interdisciplinary approach and collaboration and networking with the different institutions in India and abroad that widens the scope of education and the empowerment possibilities of the young minds. And I am happy to share with you that this year we have the 175th year of the Education Services of CMA congregation, which manages Christ Jayanti College too. It is in the year 1846, CMA congregation started the first school. That was a humble beginning. Now it manages more than 1,000 plus schools, higher education institutions, university, medical colleges, technical institutions, and other educational services. Coming to the Department of History of Christ Jayanti College, under the able and dynamic leadership of Professor Remya and her colleagues in the department, they are always vibrant in all the college activities, quality assurance, and also quality enhancement, together with participating in all the common programs of the college. the department by itself had organized 23 academic programs during the last academic year for the benefit of the student community, teacher fraternity from different colleges, and also research colleagues, and also other members who are the knowledge seekers in history. And department has scheduled to release a magazine every year. The under the title Scrolls, giving an opportunity to put in black and white, which will become a part of history in recorded form for the future generation. And undergraduate level also, the department is always vibrant to go for history projects. And during last year, 28 undergraduate students, they completed their field-based history projects. And now during this lockdown period, to meet the challenges, Professor Remya and her team has come forward this webinar on concept of self-historical perspective. I appreciate Professor Remya and her team in the history department for your thoughtfulness and also for your networking and also your goodwill to bring together everybody under one umbrella to have this sharing session today. I also appreciate Dr. Gopakumar, the Dean, and Professor Selvaraj Michael, the Coordinator for Social Science Departments, and all the members of the faculty team for your continued guidance and support. And today we have Dr. N.A. Jacob from Ramdas College, University of Delhi, to inspire us. The first instance itself, his humble way of dealing with things and his scholarly approach and his dynamic involvement in various activities in guiding, empowering, and also inspiring large number of people through these various conferences and seminars and inspiration talks. We will have an enjoyable time to have a reflection on concept of self with a historical perspective, but that will definitely guide us to go forward with the real consciousness of ourself and the self of the others. On this occasion, dear Professor Jacob, on my personal behalf too, I appreciate your dynamic presence for the day, and I appreciate all the participants for the time you have taken to be a part of this webinar. And I wish an empowering and enriching time to all of you. May God bless you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father. Your words indeed set a right tone of beginning to this webinar. And Professor Himango had spoken many things about our resource person of the day, Dr. N.A. Jacob. So I think he considered it as a privilege to introduce Professor Jacob to the participants. I welcome Professor Himango to introduce our resource person of the day.
Good morning, one and all. Like ma'am said, I actually consider it and deem it a very true honor and privilege to introduce a speaker for today's webinar, Dr. N.A. Jacob. Dr. Jacob teaches English, like it has already been pointed, at Ramjas College, University of Delhi. His doctoral thesis at Rutgers University was titled Looking Through Words, Histories of the Visual Image in 19th Century Literature. His interests include philosophy, literary theory, aesthetics, and photography studies. And I have had actually the privilege of being taught by Sir for one whole semester. One of my colleagues had recently said, and I want to quote, the art of teaching is a well-known accompanier to the art of learning. And on a personal note, does the phrase, the influencer of a good teacher can never be erased, fits rightly for Sir, because he has always been so calm and elating. His teaching techniques has etched in our hearts, and I still, to this very day, as I speak today, remember the poems and the prose he taught, some of them being A Stench of Kerosene by Amrita Pritam, Faiz Ahmed Faiz's When Autumn Came, so on and so forth. After studying for a full semester only history honors, the introduction to literature was genuinely a refreshing journey that we cherished for always. Sir has always remained not just a mere teacher to me, but a very strong guide and a mentor who has all throughout these years, he has always offered his assistance and guidance whenever needed. So it is genuinely a very great pleasure for me to welcome you to this session and to put up the introduction for you. And before I hand over the session to everyone, I request all the participants to kindly put forward any queries and questions that you would have for Sir in the chat directed towards Professor Ramya, who would be the coordinator and moderator for the session. I request Sir, Jacob Sir, to kindly take over the session. Thank you, Sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me. As a special thanks to Principal Father Joskuti and other faculty members, and a special thanks to Ramya and Imango for organizing this. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to this session, which is, like I mentioned before, my first webinar. So I'm really excited to see how this format works. Thank you very much, Imango, for those very generous, kind words. It's always gratifying to see students who've, over the years, shown a certain passion for the subject, so much so that they become colleagues and friends over the years. And so it's lovely to see you. And I'm happy to be here among so many of you. I can see that there are quite a few participants, and please let me know if I'm audible enough for, and if I stop being so, or if my video is not clear. I'd appreciate it if you let me know soon so I can fix it. Right?
Sure, sir. Now everything is clear, sir. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be speaking about the concept of self, but unlike the broad scope of my title, the concept of self, what I'm going to present is a more narrowly focused and highly selective account of a few constitutive moments from the Western philosophical tradition that configures the self in particular ways. Mine is a genealogical account that neither aims at telling a kind of linear story, nor does it claim to offer a kind of comprehensive account of the self. Instead, what I will do is to focus on a set of texts that cover a somewhat wide historical span, but allow us to identify a set of recurring questions about the self. These questions, as I hope to show, get formulated in different ways and generate very different answers across the text that I examine. Mine is largely an idealist account, I should clarify, that does not focus on various mutations of the concept of self in different historical periods. I also do not explicitly focus on gender and race or questions of identity, not because I do not think these are important coordinates of the self, but because the particular account of the self I'm going to offer you gets its traction from a somewhat different set of concerns. I should begin by noting that the very formulation of the question, what is the self, and the project of distinguishing the self from its membership to a community or nation is one that already carries with it the legacy of a modernity that allows us to pose this question in this form, what is the self? One necessary precondition, therefore, for being able to conceptualize the modern idea of self is the possibility of separating the self from a more collective and undifferentiated notion of the social, where the individual in and of itself is of little intrinsic worth. In many religions, and certainly in early Christianity, one related to God as a society, not as an individual. Collective rituals or actions that special functionaries within the church performed on behalf of the community reveal the extent to which the self is embedded in a structure of corporate membership. In contrast to this sort of embedded view of the self, we have what Charles Taylor, in a well-known book called The Modern Social Imaginary, calls the great disembedding of the self, which he claims is brought about partly by the Reformation, where we see the self acquiring some of the features of what we now know as modern individualism. Protestant theology, for instance, appeal to members of the church not simply on account of their birth, but on the basis of their deeply felt responses as individual selves. This emphasis on the individual as the new locus for a conception of religious belief then sets the stage for a whole new set of techniques of selfhood. And there's a lot that one can say here, but I think you know what I'm referring to, which is ideas of self-examination, self-doubt, and the idea of interiority. All of this becomes possible with the shift that Charles Taylor calls the great disembedding of the self from the social. The first part of this presentation will focus on the ways in which this idea of the self is produced as an act of extrication, requiring a set of surgical cuts that have to be made in order to establish certain enduring conceptual divisions that mark this notion of the self. So I'm going to begin with a figure who Father Josquity has already mentioned, which is Descartes, who, it is somewhat customary to begin the story of the self with Descartes for a number of reasons. And I think Father Josquity was absolutely right to mention Descartes as a kind of inaugural moment of thinking about the self as the new point of reference for philosophical inquiry. I'm going to focus on two texts of Descartes initially, and then I'll move on to a consideration of Locke, of John Locke, and his essay concerning human understanding. And from there on, I'll move on to German idealist philosophy, particularly in the work of Romantic philosophy and Immanuel Kant. And so I will have a few things to say on Kant and Romantic literature. Before I make a few concluding remarks about the links between the Romantic conception of self and the more recent, relatively more recent psychoanalytic theories of Freud and the Freudian notion of the self. But that's the kind of broad scope of what I'm trying to do. But I will begin with Descartes' two very central texts, one called The Discourse on Method, published in 1637, and Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1640. So these are the two. Meditations, of course, is the more well-known text that is part of many university syllabi, and whereas Discourse on Method is a kind of intellectual autobiography of how Descartes came to arrive at his particular formulation of the self as the thinking substance, which is to be distinguished from the body and the senses and a range of other things, which I'm going to talk about. Right? So Descartes begins by describing his project as one which is attempting to build a foundation for arriving at indubitable truth or certain knowledge, which is something that he hopes to establish completely, and I'm quoting him, completely on my own, he says. He hopes to find a kind of Archimedean point, which he calls the one firm, immovable point on which one can ground a philosophical investigation. So a lot of what Descartes is doing is trying to arrive at that one firm, immovable point, which can serve as a kind of anchor or the central foundation for building a whole system of knowledge. He begins by a series of skeptical maneuvers, and many of you who are familiar with Descartes, I apologize in advance for going over familiar territory, but Descartes is going to take us through a series of questions on what it is that can be cast into doubt. And he finds that the senses and all information that comes to us through the human sensorium is subject to being deceptive, unreliable, and likely to be false. The visual, the auditory, and the tactile are all possible sources of error for Descartes. And so the first kind of move he makes is to reject the senses as offering us as kind of stable foundation for knowledge. So after having kind of cast doubt on the senses, he moves to two further levels of skepticism. One, of course, is the possibility that it is impossible to distinguish between a waking state and a sleeping state, or a dreaming state, I'm sorry. So how does one know when one is dreaming and when one is in a wakeful state? He says it is entirely possible that at the very moment that he's writing this text, he could be in a dream, imagining that he's writing this text. So he then takes it one step further and brings us to the very kind of extreme point of skepticism by asking whether it is possible that even if he's in a wakeful state and conscious, what if the entire contents of his consciousness was the product of a evil deceiver who manipulated him into believing that what he sees as true is actually true. So Descartes is taking us to the very abyss of a kind of extreme skepticism, where it is almost as if nothing can be taken as indubitable or certain knowledge, because there is nothing really that stands the test of this sort of extreme skepticism. But having taken us to the very precipice of the skeptical journey, he then there is a pulling back and a drawing away from that edge, where he makes the famous kind of assertion that even if the entire contents of my consciousness and if all my thoughts are the effect of deception, that still doesn't take away from the truth that I am a thinking being. That even if the contents of my thinking may be false, that only proves that I am therefore thinking. He then goes on to suggest that the very fact that I can be deceived proves my existence. The fact that I am there to be deceived is already proof that I exist, despite my doubt and my possible deception, self-deception. So for him, the clause that to be capable of doubt is therefore to exist, and for him, therefore, the one thing that can be taken as a rock solid foundation for any system of philosophy is, as we all know, the famous formulation cogito ergo sum. The fact that my doubt does not take away from my existence as a thinking being. So he extends this faculty of doubting to other mental actions that include affirming, refusing, understanding. So a whole range of mental actions are all indicative of the fact that one exists. Right? Having established the self as what he calls the thinking thing. This is a phrase that you'll find getting repeated not only in Descartes but in a number of other philosophers, including Locke. The self as the thinking thing then becomes capable of making certain claims, certain discriminations, on the basis of which it is possible for Descartes to build an entire rationalist system of knowledge, which all find their foundation in this very primary claim that I think, therefore I am. He then goes on to reiterate that the first important distinction that needs to be made with regard to the self, and this is a very important step in the journey of the self that we'll be examining, is that we have to consider that the mind is of a substance that is fundamentally different from that of the body. That intelligent nature, what transpires in the mind, is to be distinguished from corporeal nature, and these are two completely different substances. So the self is a conceptually distinct substance as compared to the material body, to which, however, it is conjoined. But by making this cut between the mind and the body, what we now know as the dualism of Descartes, Descartes is kind of opening up for the future of philosophy a very central sort of claim about the possibility of disentangling the self as a thinking thing, which is to be distinguished from all that surrounds it in terms of, not just in terms of that which comes through sense data, but also that which comes through tradition, through common sense. He kind of places all of that within brackets to arrive at this very foundational idea that there is something called a thinking thing. Interestingly, this division between the mind and the body is mirrored or kind of doubled by an internal division within the mind. And that is the division between what Descartes calls the imagination and the understanding. Now, this is a kind of mirroring of an external division between mind and body, which now becomes possible to see as a replication of that same division within the mind, where the mind consists of two kinds of information or knowledge. One that comes to us through the imagination, which for Descartes is a kind of picture-making faculty. We picture or represent in our mind what we see outside. But the imagination, unfortunately, is only capable of producing confused, weak, intuitive, and somewhat misleading images. They don't give us an accurate representation of what is an objective truth outside. And so the imagination is kind of denigrated or downgraded in relation to the understanding, which is the faculty where it is possible to have what Descartes calls clear and distinct ideas. Now, clear and distinct ideas is Descartes' phrase for that which is indubitable knowledge, knowledge that is not subject to any form of doubt, because they represent a certain objective truth. And under this category of clear and distinct ideas, he mentions a whole range of things, including size, extension, duration, substance. These are not things that are merely the product of my imagination, but they can be independently verified as objective truths outside me. And therefore, he makes a kind of a clear distinction between imagination and understanding. This is an interesting and important distinction to hold on to, because you'll find that this very kind of foundational distinction between imagination and understanding is replicated at many different levels through a range of philosophers. It figures in Berkeley, it figures in Hume, it figures in Locke, of course, which I'm going to be talking about it. And it also figures in Kant, who comes to all of this from a very different angle. So this distinction between imagination and understanding is something I'd like you to hold on to for the moment, because I'm going to come back to it. Before we move on to other features of the self, I think it's worth mentioning that Descartes takes great pains to also distinguish the self from two or rather three other themes or ideas. One is a very, again, very foundational distinction between self and the non-human or the animal. And the human consciousness is seen as fundamentally different from that which is possessed by the animal on a number of counts, but primarily for Descartes, animals are bound by a certain kind of instinctive relationship to the world, and that instinctive relationship prevents them from having a sense of self-awareness. And it is this self-consciousness and the use of language which Descartes claims is a central distinction from the self and all that lies in the realm of the non-human and the animal. He also makes a very important distinction. I'm not going to say more about the animal here, but there's a lot more to be said because this distinction becomes very foundational for a number of 20th century philosophers, including Heidegger and more recently Agamben in a book called The Open, Man and Animal, builds on this idea of what is at stake in distinguishing between the man and the animal, or the individual and the animal. Descartes also makes a very interesting distinction between the self and that which he calls the automata or the machine, things which are put together through human ingenuity, things like the clock or any other machine that is composed of parts that are able to produce a certain kind of motion within the machine. Now he says, how does one distinguish between automata and the self? And for him, it is important to make that distinction because for him it is the freedom to be a whole range of possible things and to think a whole range of possible things that distinguishes the self from the machine. Now this is a crucial distinction which I will come back to when I cover some of the arguments that Locke offers, because the relationship between man and technicity or the machine is an idea that has also come back in various forms through a number of philosophers, both in the 19th and 20th century, where the attempt to distinguish this thing called the machine has produced a lot of interesting thoughts on what constitutes this thing called the machine. How does the human imagination produce almost like an externalization of the brain through tools which are seen as performing actions that are instrumentalized by the self? And how does one mark the distinction between these tools or machines and the self? When we come to some of Locke's descriptions of the self, this idea of the machine will become a little more clear. Just as by way of a footnote, there is a recent philosopher called Bernard Stiegler, who in a book called Techniques and Time has been trying to point out the very constitutive role played by the machine in constituting our notions of self. So for Stiegler, the self is in a very foundational way caught up with the distinction between self and machine. But let me come back to Descartes and point out one other kind of important distinction that Descartes offers us. And this is to do with the kind of very fragile definition of the self that we get in Meditation 4, which is this self as the thinking thing. As we've seen that when you disentangle many aspects of the self and are left with only this very narrow sliver of a self called the thinking thing. One problem with this very fragile notion of the self as the thinking thing is that it becomes somewhat vulnerable to a whole range of criticism. So Descartes' replies to objections from a number of philosophers have taken up this problem of this somewhat kind of attenuated or very weak notion of the self that is left after all the skeptical moves that he makes. We are left with only something called the thinking thing, which, like I said, is not able to offer us anything more than the simple assertion that the self is that which thinks. Right? Now, to counter that fragility, and almost as a kind of structural need in Descartes' argument, it becomes necessary for Descartes to find some sort of external guarantee for this self. And that external guarantee, which ensures the ontological truth of the self, is the argument about God. So for Descartes, it is the existence of God as the perfect infinite being that allows us to conceptualize the self as the finite and imperfect being. So the finitude of the self is always underwritten or guaranteed by something that lies on the other end of the spectrum, the kind of vanishing point that makes the thinking thing possible, which is the existence of God. So God in Descartes' conception represents the totality against which you measure the kind of finitude of the self. The self can only be understood as an imperfect being who has a conception of perfection, and the very fact that he has the conception of perfection proves that that being called God has to be a real possibility, not just an imagined possibility. That existence of God for Descartes is what, in a way, serves as the bulwark that holds up this entire system that Descartes presents us with. So this is a kind of standard move in a lot of rationalist philosophy, including the philosophy of Leibniz and Spinoza, to kind of create this sort of rationalist system, which is possible to create only by basing it on some foundation that is seen as a kind of rock solid foundation, which then allows one to build outwards and construct a kind of large system of knowledge. Let me now move to Locke, who is writing in 1689, about 50, 60 years after Descartes is writing. And Locke's essay concerning human understanding offers at one level, a very, very different view from Descartes. Because as you all know, Locke represents the kind of the locus classicus of what we call the empiricist tradition. He is a kind of a central point of reference in empirical philosophy, because for Locke, the self has to be distinguished not in terms of its distinction from the body, but on the contrary, he asserts in the very beginning of the essay concerning human understanding that there is nothing that the self brings with it when it is born. He calls the self an empty cabinet, and more famously, of course, he calls it the white paper or the tabula rasa and so on. But the self is conceived as completely devoid of all innate qualities. There is nothing kind of programmed into the self from the beginning. The self arrives with pretty much nothing but a state of total deprivation. It is an impoverished self that begins its journey in the world, and the only route by which it arrives at truth is through that which it gains through experience. So experience, and for Locke, experience means two things. A, that which we receive from the external world through our senses. And so all sensory data form the kind of bedrock or the absolute foundation of what we call the self. And it is through the processing of that sensory data that the self comes to have knowledge of both itself and the external world. Okay? But Locke makes a very important distinction between what he calls sensation and reflection. And these are very central categories, sensation and reflection. And he says that all that one can possibly know as a self in the world is on account of two faculties in the mind. One is sensation, which constitutes the data, the impressions that we receive from the external world through all our five senses. Sorry. And the second is the faculty of reflection. And reflection is the capacity of the mind to reflect on the operations of the mind itself. So it is a kind of self-reflexive capacity. So the self is therefore made up of these two axes, One, that which is received from outside through sensation, and the capacity of the mind to reflect upon itself and its own processes. So that self-reflection serves as a second pole that holds together the self, and the self is therefore very solidly built on these two foundations between sensation and reflection. All that can be known is the product of the interplay between sensation and reflection. All that can be taken as certain knowledge is acquired through our ability to negotiate between that which we receive from outside and that which the mind is able to perform as an internal activity of self-awareness. So on this sensation-reflection distinction, he builds another very famous distinction, which is been the subject of a lot of philosophical debate, especially in the 20th century, which is the distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. For Locke, there are two kinds of information that we are able to discern. One, what he calls primary qualities, which is a kind of direct apprehension of the real, original, and objective qualities of the world that we see outside us. It's a kind of direct apprehension, and it resides in things such as solidity, extension, mobility. These are all measurable, again, like Descartes would call indisputable qualities that reside in the thing itself, rather than in the mind that is encountering the thing. Right? As opposed to primary qualities that therefore offer us a kind of direct apprehension of the world, you have secondary qualities, which are qualities that are produced by sensations in us that do not figure in the things themselves. These are not qualities that reside in the things, but merely in our response to those things. And under this category, he mentions things like taste, color, and sound, which are qualities that we are able to experience as individuals, but these qualities are purely internal qualities. They don't reflect the truth of what lies outside. Right? So this somewhat similar architecture of Locke's argument, although he's speaking from a completely different premise, which is the empirical premise, you find that in Locke also there is a sort of division between the external world and the mind, and between sensation and reflection, and between primary qualities and secondary qualities, which in some rough way map on to what Descartes would call the imagination and understanding. But of course, there are fundamental differences. Like I said, Descartes is a rationalist model that does not believe in sensory data. He believes that it is possible for the mind to, through its own intellect, through the use of clear and distinct reason, we can arrive at truth independently of what our bodies tell us. So as opposed to that, Locke is making a far more kind of materialist empirical claim that all that we know is possible to authenticate largely on the interplay of what we receive from outside and that which the mind performs as an internal operation within itself. Right? So from here, I'd like to transition a little bit to another very important chapter in Locke. It's in Book 2, in Chapter 11, called Personal Identity. And in the section describing personal identity, Locke defines the self as that conscious thinking thing, which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain. This is, I'm quoting from Locke, and is so concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. So for Locke, it is the extension of that consciousness over time that allows for something called personal identity to be possible, because the ability to stitch one moment to the next moment and our past to our present is what enables the continuity of personal identity. So the self is further clarified as being not just a thinking thing, but also a thinking thing that extends in time And this is a very central feature of a lot of modern philosophy about the self, where philosophers like Kant and more recently in the 20th century, Bergson and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger would all use time as a very central feature of what we call the self. For Heidegger, the Dasein is constituted in a very primal sense by a certain time consciousness. It is a notion of temporality that allows the self to function in relation to itself and others. Right? So time becomes a very central idea, and maybe if I can digress for a moment, the idea of a future is very important idea for a number of these philosophers, especially Heidegger. The capacity to imagine the self as always facing a future which it is entering through the past, and the future is always that horizon which is opening up in front of the self, and that sort of futural thinking for Heidegger is a kind of central and very constitutive aspect of the self. To make the digression that I was hoping to very briefly make here is a reference to our own times and the ongoing pandemic. I think one fallout of the coronavirus is that it has upset our ability to imagine the future. We are not able to keep ourselves kind of calibrate our present in relation to an immediate future. We don't know whether this is going to last 2 months or 6 months or 1 year or 2 years. And there is a kind of uncertainty about the very idea of the future, which I think is going to take a toll on the way we think about our own self. Because what the pandemic, this is just a kind of off the cuff remark, and I haven't really thought about this very deeply, but I do know that we are forced to live in a certain kind of present moment thanks to the pandemic. We are constantly keeping ourselves updated on the present, because it's as if the future has receded beyond what our imagination allows us to kind of map. We don't have a sense of that future, and therefore we find ourselves confined to the very immediate present. I find that is just one kind of a gloss on this idea of self and notions of time. But to come back to Locke, time and memory therefore play a very crucial role in the economy of this thinking thing called the self. And the self is capable of a certain identity of consciousness or a continued consciousness. So the fact that I can stitch my today with my yesterday and my day before yesterday is what allows me to have this sort of a continued consciousness, which can be extended, Locke says, to the past. And it is that extension into the past that allows me to have a sense of identity. Not so much just living in the present moment, but also being able to conceive of myself as a continuing consciousness. Now let me come to a very interesting metaphor that Locke uses. And this is a metaphor that is of such great importance that you'll find it used by a whole range of philosophers in the 17th and 18th and even in 20th century philosophy. And this is the metaphor of what is called the Camera Obscura. For those who don't know it, the Camera Obscura is a kind of contraption which resembles a kind of dark room, which the individual is seen as sitting, or this is actually a contraption used for painters who would sit in this dark room, which had a hole on one of its walls, and a lens placed on that hole would allow images of the image of the external world to be formed as a picture in the internal wall of this dark room. So if you sit in the dark room, you are able to see on the back wall of this, or the wall facing the hole, a little visual image of that which is outside. Right? So the Camera Obscura was a very kind of popular painterly device used by painters to actually delineate a kind of picture plane that is more stable and fixed, as opposed to the moving and unstable kind of visual data that you get by just looking at the world. By looking at the image formed on the back wall of the camera obscura, the painter is able to get a much more greater stability and a hold on what he's viewing. So Locke uses this metaphor of the camera obscura, and I must say that this is not a oh, thank you so much, Ramya. That's wonderful. This is exactly what I'm referring to, which is this capacity to sit within this box to see an image that is formed, which is often, and as the picture here shows, an inverted image, but it is an image nevertheless of what you see, what is visible in the external world, but now translated into a kind of neat visual picture that appears on the wall of the camera obscura. It's interesting. Let me just quickly look at and read for you Locke's use of the camera obscura metaphor. He says that the external and internal sensations that are like windows by which light is let into this dark room. For the understanding is not unlike a closet, or what he calls a cupboard or an empty cabinet, wholly shut from light, with only some little opening left to let in the external visible resemblances or ideas.
Yeah,
of
your
things.
audio is not. Yeah. You have some audio trouble. Yes.
Is it okay now?
Now okay, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So Locke describes this camera obscura as the closet or the dark room into which, through a little opening, there are visible resemblances or ideas of things which are without, and that appear in the room as pictures coming into the dark room to stay there and lie so orderly as to be found upon occasion that it would resemble the very model of the understanding. So for Locke, the very idea of the human mind finds an analogy in the camera obscura. The camera obscura offers a very neat analogy of what Locke is describing as this receiving of data and the capacity of the mind to examine its own data. Right? Please let me know if am I audible now? Is it okay? Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to spend a little time on the idea of the camera obscura because it's going to be central to what I'm going to say after this. And let me just quickly note that this has been used by a number of philosophers, including Descartes, who uses it in a book called Dioptrics. He uses the same idea, the model of the camera obscura. It's used by Newton, it's used by Berkeley, it's used by Leibniz, and more recently it's used by Bergson, and most famously perhaps used by Marx in the German ideology, where the camera obscura serves as a model of ideology, which provides an inverted image of what is a true relation of the modes of production that are outside. So for Marx, the camera obscura is a model that allows one to understand ideology. But what is interesting here is that I'm fascinated by the extent to which what is actually a machine or an apparatus is taken to stand in as a model of the mind. It's interesting that the mind becomes explainable in relation to this sort of machine called this machine for seeing called the camera obscura, and it's almost as if the machine comes to stand in for that which is the internal theater of the mind. So the consciousness itself becomes explainable in terms of this sort of machinic idea of the camera obscura. And it gets this idea of an internal chamber or a dark room is identified by a number of scholars on visual culture, which happens to be a field that I'm interested in. A lot of visual scholars have spent a lot of time describing this metaphor of the camera obscura. Jonathan Crary, W.J.T. Michel, and a whole range of visual theorists have tried, Sarah Kaufman have offered reflections on this idea of the camera obscura. So what I'm trying to point to is that it becomes what Crary calls, Jonathan Crary, in a book called Techniques of the Observer, he calls it a kind of metaphysic of interiority. The camera obscura represents a model of interiority. It becomes a kind of privatized subject who is seen confined in the dark room, who cut off from the public or exterior world, is now able to apprehend images of the world, not directly, but through this sort of mediated relationship between the world and its representation within the camera obscura. So what is fascinating for Crary is that this becomes a very kind of model to imagine the mind as the solitary individual confined to the dark room, who sits within this closed interior, cut off from the external world, but it is by cutting himself off from the external world that he is able to arrive at a certain kind of stable system of knowledge. So this is also bringing us closer to Descartes, because as you recall, Descartes' whole argument was that to rely on our senses is to be led into error. To conceive of the camera obscura as a way of stabilizing the images of the eye in such a way that we are able to arrive at some sort of a stable representation of the external world, also allows us to think of this camera obscura as a kind of very rational model, where we are able to find ordered and stable images of the external world thanks to this machine. So the objectivity of visual experience is in the camera obscura possible only by virtue of a kind of disembodied witnessing that happens within the dark room. And the solitary individual who is cut off from the world and sits in the dark room is able to introspect and examine the pictures that he has before him. But this introspection and this knowledge comes at a cost, and that cost is, of course, as we know, a direct visual access of the world. So it's important to remember that the camera obscura does not allow us to look through a kind of hole and see the world, but even inside the camera obscura, all you're able to see are pictures of the world. You don't see the world as it is apprehended by the eye, but you see a picture of the world mediated by the apparatus called the camera obscura. And this becomes a wonderful metaphor of this whole inside-outside sort of tension that you find in Locke. And one reading of Locke would suggest that you already have in Locke a kind of critique of empiricism. You already have in Locke the possibility of going beyond empiricism, because if in this lonely, dark room, you're already conceiving of the self as a kind of disembodied figure who is cut off from the world and comes to know the world only through this sort of disconnect with the world. It's only by disconnecting yourself from the world that you can actually see the world. This seems to strike at the roots of a kind of simple idea of empiricism, because it's simple sense data do not give you an adequate representation of how the mind works, but it is something like the camera obscura that tells you more about the workings of the mind. Now, this has very major literary implications, and I'm just going to spend a few minutes on some of the literary implications of what all this means, which is that the idea of a third-person narrator in novel form, or even a first-person narrator, the possibility of having a kind of God's eye view, the possibility of always being located in a kind of ambiguous zone between that which you represent and that capacity to relay that representation through words. So the literary is, especially in its modern forms, have kind of tended to draw on this model of interiority as a subject who is both in the world but also cut off from the world, both capable of a certain kind of immersion in the world, but comes to know himself or herself only through a certain distancing from the world. And so the the idea of irony and narrative distance in the novel form, for instance, is also drawing on the same capacity for both being able to have immediate experience, but also to stand back from immediate experience and to reflect on experience. So the capacity to represent experience becomes far more important in a number of literary genres that kind of uses this space between the external and the internal. Right? So what we get is a kind of bifurcation or a split between experience and the representation of experience, which is a good transition to arrive at when we're moving from Locke to Kant. And Kant, as many of you probably know, represents the a kind of very, very compelling anti-empirical move. Kant's entire philosophy in the three critiques is an attempt to reject empiricism and arrive at a certain kind of mediated understanding of experience that is not going to allow for the individual to have any direct access to the world, but as we all know, Kant is going to create a whole system that is based on the possibility that the self cannot possibly know the thing in itself, that all that we call understanding that is possible within the self is only the product of a certain kind of transcendental grammar in the mind, kind of pre-inscribed software, if you will, that allows us to understand the world through certain a priori categories and concepts, which are able to access the world only through those categories. There is no direct access to the world possible. So one of the big changes that you see with Kantian critiques, which is known as the Copernican turn in philosophy, is this move which is called the transcendental turn, not to a kind of transcendent reality, but to categories in the mind. Not knowledge based on experience, but knowledge that is produced largely through the application of certain a priori categories through which the world can be apprehended. There is no direct access to the world possible, so of claiming for itself
Sorry, some audio issues.
any sort of.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Continue,
maybe
please.
I should.
Yes. Now you're fine, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes,
So
sir.
in Kant, there's a kind of acceptance of the fact that human knowledge is marked by a kind of finitude. There is no objective truth possible. There is no direct access to the thing in itself possible, and all that we can know is that which is mediated through our through these categories of time, causality, and space, and so on and so forth. So the thing in itself becomes forever, following Kant, barred from human knowledge. We have no apprehension, no direct apprehension of the world, and so it is only through these categories that we are able to arrive at some sort of system of knowledge. This is not to say that Kant is kind of indulging in a certain kind of skepticism, because part of what Kant is responding to is the skepticism that he sees in Hume. So, as he famously says, Hume woke me up from my dogmatic slumber. And for Kant, it is a kind of fine line between this kind of skepticism of Hume, which claims that there is nothing that we really know except that which we know through custom or habit, which allows us to know certain truths, which are not in any way representative of objective truth. So Kant is trying to find a way to critique that sort of extreme skepticism in Kant, in Hume, I'm sorry, but also at the same time try to reject the straightforward empiricism of someone like Locke, if you could read him as a simple empiricist, by trying to tread a fine balance between the sort of skepticism and empirical philosophy, by claiming that it is possible to have a very solid foundation for understanding, so long as we do not claim for our knowledge any sort of direct access to the thing in itself. The categories, the a priori concepts that we use offer a firm foundation for us to know the world, and we can therefore experience the world through that we can understand the world through those categories, and we can have a scientific knowledge of the world based on these categories that allow us a certain systematized knowledge about the world. So for Kant, and this is particularly true of what the first critique is about, which is the critique of pure reason, it is possible to have knowledge of the world through the use of these categories, which, like I have mentioned already, starts with the premise that every sensory data that we receive, what Kant calls the sensory manifold, can only be intelligible when it is subsumed under categories, conceptual categories that make the kind of individual particular thing that we see intelligible through those categories. Now, of course, it works both ways, that categories are empty without particulars, but particulars become intelligible only through categories. And so for Kant, it is possible to therefore arrive at some sort of a stable system of knowledge through our acknowledgement of these fundamental a priori categories that serve as the foundation for a system of knowledge. But Kant is interesting for me not only because of his attempt to make this sort of Copernican turn, but also because he goes on to write the second and third critique, and I'm myself interested in the third critique, and I'm very much a third critique Kantian in that sense, because if you read the third critique as offering another perspective on what we can know, then the third critique becomes a sort of book that offers the limits of what pure reason can tell us. So the third critique and what he calls the faculty of aesthetic judgment is possible primarily on the grounds that there are things that are possible for the human imagination to discern, primarily by way of the beautiful and the sublime, that are not open to conceptual determination. So when I'm able to make an aesthetic judgment on something like what I call the beautiful, that judgment is a judgment that is able to detect a certain purposiveness in that object that I'm seeing, but that purposiveness does not have a cognizable purpose. So all the categories of what we call determinative judgment, which is what the first critique is concerned with, are replaced by what in the third critique is known as reflective judgment. That is the capacity to make claims about beauty and the sublime, which are able to use concepts without being conceptual. So all of this assumes a certain sort of disinterested beholder and observer who is not using any of the objects that he identifies as the beautiful, the sublime, as objects that are of any self-interest to him. But because of that disinterestedness of the observer, he is able to make certain claims of say, things like beautiful, which are highly subjective claims, but at the same time are also universal claims. When I say that something is beautiful, I'm making a claim both on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of everyone else. This is opposed to something like agreeableness, which is merely a kind of private taste. What I find good is what is personal to me. But when I make a claim of beauty, that claim is necessarily also a claim that establishes a certain universal validity, and that allows Kant to sort of offer us a term that sounds like a kind of contradiction, which is a subjective universality. Subjective universality. So for Kant, the third critique offers a certain sort of limit to all that can be known through pure reason, because we are able to intuit through our imagination a certain relationship between the imagination and the understanding. But that relationship between the imagination and the understanding, which we saw in Descartes as an absolute divide, here in Kant, the imagination and the understanding in the third critique are able to arrive at a certain kind of mediated, negotiated sort of balance between the two, which does not fall into the category of anything that can be reduced to the realm of a concept. So beauty and all aesthetic judgments are that which allows us to make certain claims but never arrive at a determinate concept of the beautiful, which for Kant, the moment I can cognize and conceptualize what is beautiful, then the beautiful becomes something that I can repeat endlessly. Whereas all aesthetic judgments are singular judgments, unrepeatable judgments. There are irreducible judgments. I cannot kind of know in advance what I will find beautiful. The beautiful is always that which comes to me, not at my bidding. I don't decide to find the beautiful. The beautiful kind of appears before me, and I'm able to make a judgment on an aesthetic judgment. But that judgment never lends itself to conceptualization. Right? So the point I'm making here via Kant's third critique, and what I'm claiming is a very major innovation in the very way we think about the self, is that the third critique is offering us a certain notion of aesthetics, which represents a kind of limit of all that we can know about the world. And so aesthetics and aesthetic judgment more generally, for Kant, offers a certain kind of relationship with pure reason that is not reducible to pure reason. There is no way in which the aesthetic judgment and pure reason can be made to find ways to adequate with each other. There is a kind of irreducible difference between the aesthetic and that which can be known through the understanding. So this already leads us to a certain kind of limit to what the self can be said to stand for in terms of understanding, and it also allows me to kind of say a little bit about romantic literature, which following Kant makes this sort of very basic distinction between the universal and the particulars. Romantic literature is not interested in general truths. It's not interested in that which can be seen to represent a kind of approximation of the truth, or probability, or average notions of the truth, but it is only through unique particularities or minute particulars, as Blake calls them, that literature is possible to kind of express itself. So, in a very well-known, perhaps the most well-known book of romantic literary criticism by a scholar called M.H. Abrams, a book called The Mirror and the Lamp, M.H. Abrams makes a distinction between earlier aesthetic theories, which he claims are based on mimetic mirror models, where literature is primarily meant to reflect an external order or truth, as opposed to the romantic aesthetic theories, which for M.H. Abrams are better expressed through the metaphor of the lamp, which for Abrams is the principle of a kind of inner illumination, where the self is able to project meanings outwards onto the world, and the self is not therefore the receiver of data anymore, but the self can also be that kind of that locus from which meanings are generated outwards. The self constitutes meaning through its outward gaze. The self projects meaning onto the world rather than simply receiving meaning as if it were a kind of receptacle for the data that arrives from the external world. So this mirror lamp distinction is a kind of very central distinction in romantic aesthetic theory, but I'm not going to go into many more details. I realize I'm running out of time. How many minutes do I have left? I mean, do I have like 5 minutes more?
Sir, yes, sir. In another 5 minutes, can we have our discussion?
Okay, great. I think I should be able to wind up.
Yes, sir. Freud, you have to. Freud is left. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So very briefly, then I think that there is a very solid case to be made that a lot of romantic literature is based on the idea that the self is never fully present to itself. I'm never fully aware of my own consciousness and the dimensions of my consciousness, because there are many aspects of consciousness that are possible to arrive at only through contingent experiences. A lot of romantic poetry is therefore marked by these sorts of contingent moments, what Wordsworth calls spots of time, which are never there for us or can be made available through our conscious bidding, but it kind of arrives at us in a kind of pure contingency. Similarly, a lot of romantic literature is interested in that which can be understood merely as a kind of, and I'll just read out a short line from the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. This is the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Excuse me. So Wordsworth says that the romantic poet is one whose disposition is affected by absent things, as if they were present. And for the romantic poet, he claims that it is always possible to conjure up in himself, through an effort of the imagination, things which are not immediately present before it. And for a lot of romantic poets, there is therefore a gap between the thing in itself or direct experience and the mental recreation of that experience through poetry. So there is in romantic experience a kind of breach or a break between the event and its kind of belated reconstruction in romantic poetry that is marked by a kind of temporal delay or a temporal fracture that is really a delay or a break between sensation and reflection. So since the romantics are constantly aware of the inability to access direct experience, there is a kind of ubiquitous nostalgia for that sort of direct experience, which comes across very often in an obsession with childlike states, which are states that represent a kind of unself-conscious relationship with nature, or states of mind that are represented through dreams or through opium-induced reveries, which are better able to allow us understanding of the external world rather than the conscious mind. And so this awareness of a lack of self-presence, I think, is the reason why romantic literature and romantic philosophy more broadly has often been seen as linked to psychoanalysis, and especially of the Freudian variety, where there is a consciousness of the self as not being present to itself. And that which I am not able to access, realms of my own consciousness that are barred from my conscious experience, often rupture my consciousness in through a variety of means. So for Freud, it is through dreams, and it is through slips of tongue, and it is through certain certain kind of breakdown of our normative functioning as a kind of as a self. It is through the moments of breakdown that we are able to see the unconscious making its presence felt in our conscious mind. Right? So one can see that the self is now being cast in an entirely new form in Freud, where we enter what is now called the hermeneutics of the self, where the self is to take a leaf from Foucault's history of sexuality and a book called Technologies of the Self. The self is always seen as hiding within itself certain impurities or certain inner thoughts that have to be teased out of the mind through certain practices of truth-telling. So certain practices of confession in the religious sense for Foucault is only a kind of religious version of more secular models of the confession that we find in psychoanalysis, which is also a kind of talking cure or a talking therapy, whereby by speaking and expressing ourselves, we through free association are able to reveal aspects of our unconscious that are not available to us consciously. So this hermeneutics of the self becomes a whole new technology of the self, which becomes through which it becomes possible to see the self as constantly engaged in certain forms of self-examination, truth-telling, certain forms of self-doubt, and the entire technology of coming to terms with those aspects of the self which are kind of occulted from view, which are not clear to our own consciousness. That becomes a whole project of the self in itself. So the self becomes now conceivable only as this process of self-examination, which is a kind of open-ended process of self-examination that never quite arrives at closure. Maybe I should stop here now, and just I'd be happy to talk about your responses to some of these models of the self that I think are useful in kind of laying bare the historical sort of architecture of the self as it pans out from Descartes to say someone like Freud. There's a lot more to be said, of course, and this is, and I'm guilty of many sins of omission here, and there's many other things that one could possibly say, but I'm going to try and stop here so that we can get some time for discussion. So thank you very much, and thank you for your patience.
Sir, it was indeed a wonderful session, sir. In a very, even though you said there's a lot of omission, but you had actually covered a period starting from Descartes period, from 16th century to modern age. You have spoken about all famous Western ideas with regard to self and its philosophy. So it was indeed a very, very comprehensive session, sir. So I feel there are a few questions which can come up. So I shall open the floor for discussion. Meanwhile, I can also project some of your ideas that you had said as shared slides. If anybody would like to have them, they can have them also. So the floor is open for discussion. You may kindly type your question in the chat box, or participants can raise their hand so that we can unmute them. We have a question. How do you negotiate between self and personality? Are they same? I have doubt regarding this. Mr. Sudarshan Kumar had asked this question, sir. How do you negotiate between self and personality?
And so personality, as if by personality you mean a certain self-image of how we conceive of ourselves, uh, uh, I would think that personality is therefore a perpetually moving and mobile quantity. One good reference point to think about this is a term from Renaissance literature called self-fashioning. And I think one way of thinking about personality is through this idea of self-fashioning, where we imagine ourselves as constantly involved in a certain plastic notion, where we can think of the self as manipulable, as capable of modification, and we can play roles, and that self-fashioning allows us to perceive of personality as an ongoing and processual thing rather than a kind of stable or unitary thing. I feel personality in this sense becomes that project of the self, which is, like I said, an unfolding that that opens up to the many possibilities that the self can see itself in terms of, but which also comes at a cost. And so, like I think I alluded to this in my presentation, that if myself is a manipulable thing, which can be, like I said, altered and made to answer to different needs, then I'm also aware of the self as not having a certain kind of core, of lacking a certain foundation. Now, my fear or anxiety that myself is only a series of masks that I wear, but lacks the idea of a certain stable core that underlies it, is also a subject of much anxiety in literature. So in the Renaissance, the work of Stephen Greenblatt is largely to show the kind of tension between the empowering aspects of self-fashioning and the anxiety-producing aspects of self-fashioning. Because the moment you enter into the realm of disguise and play, you're also aware of a certain mobility of the self, a certain instability within the self.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I request Professor Alna ma'am to kindly raise the question that ma'am has typed in the chat box. Professor Alna.
Thank you, sir, for the session. I have a doubt. So since John Locke said that mind is a tabula rasa, is there a kind of contradiction to the Romantic poets, their literature? Because without the sensation and reflection, is nostalgia possible?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I should clarify that mine is a kind of against the grain reading of Locke. You're absolutely right that Locke is providing us with a certain kind of conceptual infrastructure that allows us to have a stable system of knowledge thanks to the interplay between sensation and reflection. So Locke does not kind of envisage the Romantic project. So all I'm trying to say is that some of the metaphors, like the Camera Obscura in Locke, lend themselves to a kind of alternative reading of the mind, where it is possible to see a kind of basic disjunct between the mind as cut off from direct access to reality, and that brings us very, very close to a kind of Kantian model of the mind as closed off from the external world, as having no direct access to the external world. So I'm kind of pushing Locke to yield meanings that he's perhaps not intending to offer. But I just think that the metaphor of the Camera Obscura, because it gets used in so many diverse ways, lends itself to this sort of double reading. And therefore the Romantic possibility of nostalgia for the kind of immediate apprehension of the world is is a feature or a symptom of the lonely creature in the dark room. The lonely creature in the dark room is for the Romantics, perpetually left with a longing for some sort of direct access. He doesn't have that access and therefore can only imagine that world through a series of representations of that world. But the hankering after that world does not quite leave the Romantic poet, who will come to it only in forms like the child, or in like Wordsworth, in many of the poems of the lyrical ballads, like the Idiot Boy, or the figure of the dreamer, or of the reverie in Coleridge's Kubla Khan, where it is only through that sort of dream state that one can conceive of some sort of a direct apprehension of that world. But thank you for that question, and I think it's a good clarification to make that Locke is not kind of actually offering us that romantic reading. That is my reading of Locke. That is
Thank you, sir. We have another question from Professor Rebok. Would you like to unmute and ask the question, Rebok?
Hello, good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am. So my question is, since Girish Karnad has a very different idea of the concept of self in the text Hayavadana, is there a difference between the Indian context of the ideology of self to that of the Western concept, sir?
I have to confess that I'm not familiar with the Karnad text, which I haven't. I know about it. I know that it's a very interesting reflection on the self, and it takes up an idea that is taken up by Locke quite centrally. That is, if I occupy another body, will I be the same self? It's a bit like the ship of Theseus sort of problem. That is, what is identity? If every part of me is to be replaced by another part, will I still claim for myself a certain continuity of consciousness? Am I the same person who I am if I were to inhabit another body? So if I get you right, that sort of reflection on self-awareness is certainly part of a kind of thought experiment that you find in a number of philosophers, including Locke and including Descartes. In fact, in Descartes' Dioptrics, there are a few such experiments about what would happen if we deviate from the normative understanding of consciousness and imagine strange occurrences like monstrous images striking the eye and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure if I've answered your question, but I do think that there are points of contact, but I don't think I can say with any clarity that there is a convergence between the Karnad and the Indian system, where the self is a subject of philosophical inquiry in perhaps a very different way as compared to this sort of disembodied self that we see in Descartes and Locke, which is, yeah, I'll stop.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I have another question from Professor Janani. Ma'am, can you ask the question? PV Janani. Janani? May I read the question? Janani, ma'am, you're live. You have been unmuted. Okay, I shall ask the question. Do all these philosophies put forward has a common idea that we need to be unconscious to reach the conscious? Do we need to be unconscious to reach the conscious?
Well, that's a great question, and especially because it kind of speaks to the tension between that which we know and that which we are kind of that which is closed off from us. And so it is in moments of a certain kind of unconsciousness or or a lack of self-consciousness in moments of a certain kind of immersion in the present, that we are least conscious of ourselves. So, again, Heidegger has a lovely section in part 1 of Being and Time, where he says that, to be in the world and to be immersed in the present is to have the idea of oneself kind of blurred out of focus. You don't know yourself until there are moments when the self comes to the fore. And so to be unconscious of your own self or your own identity allows you a certain kind of unself-conscious relationship with the world, which is perhaps not possible for the conscious mind. And so I think that's the kind of trade-off between the reflection that Locke talks about, where the moment we enter into the capacity to reflect on that which we receive, we have already moved away from that sort of direct apprehension. We are no longer in the world, but we are already out of the world, imagining our relationship with that world. And so that sort of inside-outside tension speaks exactly to what you're describing as how the unconscious allows us to become conscious in a kind of strange way that perhaps consciousness does not. And just to give you one example of this, there is this fascinating field called attention studies about how the mind is able to stay focused on certain self-conscious and self-aware ideas only up to a point. And so attention studies suggest that the mind weaves in and out of consciousness. There are moments when you are able to sustain a very highly focused sense of consciousness. But there are also moments when the ambient atmosphere around you will distract you and prevent you from being as focused and conscious of that present moment. So attention studies shows that it is perhaps contrary to expectation, not when you are most focused that you are most receptive. In fact, you are most focused when you are able to enjoy a kind of healthy dialectic between the sort of focus and going out of focus. It is that going out of focus that enables a certain kind of receptivity to the world, which unfortunately is not open to that sort of high focus that you imagine in all conscious activity. And so I think you're absolutely right that sometimes it is the deviation from the conscious that allows us to be truly conscious at a different level.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I have one more question. Probably I shall restrict to this last question. One of the students have asked, I think, is the selfie culture of today reflects a different idea of self, taking one's own selfies?
Yeah, well, as someone who's interested in photography, I've thought about this a bit, and I do feel that there is a kind of major mutation in the way we think about pictorial representation that comes into being through the selfie. The selfie has made it possible for us to become accustomed to our own images, to images of ourselves, in a way that no other culture has been comfortable with. I mean, there's a certain level of comfort with. Sorry, so let me rephrase that. One is comfortable in the presence of one's own image, in a way that one is now in the culture of selfies that one was never in the early phases of photography. And one has only to look at a lot of 19th century photography, or even some examples of 19th century photography, to notice the extreme discomfort and somewhat artificial energy required to pose before a camera. The posing before a camera always was a trying experience because exposure times were long. Sometimes it took up to 5 to 10 minutes for a shot to be taken. So you had to sit with great stillness, and you often needed mechanical props to hold you in place, like hold your head in place, which are not visible to the camera, of course. But posing has always been an experience of anxiety. Barthes's Camera Lucida is a text that speaks to the sort of anxiety of posing. But I think we've come a long way from the anxiety of posing to the sort of ubiquitous nature of the selfie, where now the selfie has become a normative mode of self-representation, a kind of visual self-archiving that happens at an astonishing rate, where selfies are taken at the drop of a hat, and they kind of do not represent a kind of special moment in the self. This is, if I could just take one more minute to say a little bit more, that my own reading of the selfie is comes to the realization that in a lot of protocols of 20th century photography, to pose before a camera required you to compose yourself into a certain kind of essence that you required to hold together for the duration of the shot. And that pressure to be yourself in that special moment when you posed for the camera has considerably eased with the selfie. The selfie does not claim for itself any sort of essence, as the self as essence. When you pose for a selfie, you're already thinking about the self not as a stable essence, which can be represented through a photograph, but the self has already become a series. It has already become that which is a subject of constant deferral. I am, here I am at this moment, sitting before my students. Here is me eating in a restaurant. Here is me traveling to a foreign location. So there is a constant sense of the self as not that which can be found to reside in one moment, but instead the self is only understood as this sort of deferred moments, a series of moments. And the selfie therefore allows for a whole new protocol of self-representation. You are never one image, you are only that which exists in the series. And so therefore you have that idea of digital photography that is quantitatively staggering in its volume as compared to the somewhat more serious and somewhat more limited economy of analog photography, where you had to take the shot a lot more seriously than you did now for the selfie. So yeah, there's a whole new technology of the self that's assumed by the selfie, which I think is not assumed in earlier photography. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As you rightly said, that having a clear and concise thought of anything, any reason, enables us to grow and enables us to understand what we are. So clear and indistinct knowledge of what is self is what we got from you today, Professor Jacob. We are indeed very, very grateful to you for agreeing to come to us and to speak to us in this first webinar organized by the Department of History. So I'm very happy to have collaborated with you. And Professor has indeed made us to feel again that philosophy is a science. Self-introspection can also be very scientific method. It need not be abstract. There are people whom I have heard that you need to not have certain level of connection to the world in order to understand about yourself. But your discourse today also pointed out to great philosophical ideas, who are philosophers who have also pondered upon those thoughts, and they have reflected it and they have presented it. I think it's right time for all of us to go back and read these ideas again, and then find out that the so-called 21st century ideas were found in the 15th and 16th century. So the historical theory, which is cyclical, one of the theory is cyclical theory, that it's rather than a straight road, history always revolves in cycles. So probably in this time of uncertainty, it is necessary that we take time to self-introspect, to understand from our own experiences, from the senses that we possess, and grow to be a better individual of tomorrow. And there is a map for tomorrow, there is hope for tomorrow. So this session was indeed very, very useful to us. And there were around 110 participants. That's the maximum number of today's session. So I'm very happy for all of them who had an opportunity to listen to you and reflect on this given time. So thank you, Professor Jacob, for accepting our invitation. I thank our management. I thank our principal especially for being with us throughout the session and for being a great mentor to us. So thank you, Father Joskuti PD. I also use this opportunity to thank the colleagues of my department, the Dean of Faculty of Humanities, as well as the fellow history department professors who have joined from all over India. Then the young students who are studying history, English, even physics have joined today in session. So that way is indeed a great time in the Department of History, Mr. Jayanti College. So thank you one and all for joining with us. I have passed on the URL for feedback form. Kindly fill the feedback form and submit to us. We eagerly await for your suggestions for the next program. I would also take this opportunity to announce the next Friday, that is June 19th, we are organizing our next webinar in the webinar series of Department of History, India in the post-COVID-19 situation, with focus on India's strategic relations and foreign policy. So I welcome you all for that session also. So thank you all. And I hope you received the feedback URL. Kindly use it to submit your feedback and obtain your e-certificate. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you once again for inviting me.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jacob, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
We'll meet again in Bangalore.
Yes, sir.
I look forward to it. I hope so. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Emnia, for the presentation and the conduct of
So
this
thank you, sir. Thank you.
interesting webinar.
Thank you, Father. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramya, for being a great moderator. And,
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
really smooth. I was nervous
yes.
when I began this because I wasn't sure whether the technology will fail us as it is often prone to do. But I'm so glad that we've got through the session without any major hiccups. So I think we should also recognize that this is for the foreseeable future the modality of much of our intellectual engagement. And so it's something that we should perhaps get used to connect with each other in a virtual sense.
So what we were asking for educational reforms for last 20 years, probably the last 20 days have done it. So the entire world of education is rapidly changing, catching up with the technology, and teachers are learning as much as possible to use all new technologies. So indeed, it is an opportunity, sir. Thank you so much, sir. So participants, if you have noted your feedback URL, you may use it, and you can press the leave button for exit. We look forward to your participation for the next week seminar also. Thank you.